Cities often conceal suffering behind routine. Streets remain busy, voices continue to rise, and daily life moves forward even when private loss has no place to rest. In such spaces, grief is expected to be managed, hidden, or eventually forgotten. Yet history remembers those who refuse to carry sorrow quietly, allowing loss itself to become a form of witness. In 18th century St. Petersburg, an imperial city shaped by order and display, one woman would step outside every expectation placed upon her. Her response to death did not seek explanation or resolution. Instead, it unfolded through absence, wandering, and a deliberate stripping away of all that once defined security. Known to the city simply as Xenia, her life would pass largely without records, dates, or personal testimony. What endured was not biography, but memory. Through years of obscurity, prayer, and voluntary poverty, her presence became inseparable from the streets themselves, leaving behind a quiet legacy shaped by grief, transformed into devotion. Xenia was the wife of Colonel Andrei Fyodorovich Petrov, who served as a court chorister in the imperial capital. Their life together belonged to the ordered world of 18th century St. Petersburg, shaped by rank, duty, and stability. This balance was shattered when her husband died suddenly, leaving her a widow at the age of 26, unprepared for a future defined by absence. The death of Andrei did not remain a private sorrow. It altered the course of Xenia's life in ways that confounded those around her. Grief did not lead her toward withdrawal within the household, nor toward measured mourning expected by society. Instead, it pressed outward, reshaping every visible aspect of her existence. Soon after her husband's death, Xenia distributed all her possessions to the poor. Property, clothing, and household goods passed from her hands without hesitation. What remained was not reserve or planning, but exposure. The material signs of her former life dissolved quickly, leaving behind a woman unanchored from social expectation. She began dressing exclusively in her husband's military garments, adopting his clothing as her own. With this act, she also took his name, calling herself Andrei Fyodorovich. The boundaries between widowhood and identity blurred, unsettling those who encountered her in the streets. To relatives and acquaintances, her behavior appeared as the loss of reason. Concerned attempts were made to intervene, to provide care or restore order. Xenia responded simply, insisting that she lacked nothing. Her refusal was not marked by bitterness, but by calm detachment from former needs. From this point forward, her life unfolded in public view. She wandered among the poorest districts of St. Petersburg, sharing space with beggars, laborers, and those pushed to the margins. The city became her dwelling, its streets replacing the shelter she had relinquished. What many perceived as madness gradually revealed a different rhythm. Xenia accepted only the most basic offerings of bread or shelter, never accumulating or securing comfort. Each day remained unplanned, shaped by dependence rather than control. At night, she refused refuge entirely. Leaving the city behind, she walked into open fields beyond its edges. There, exposed to cold and wind, she spent the hours in prayer, unseen by those who judged her by daylight alone. Through this radical renunciation, Xenia entered a life defined by vulnerability. Loss did not recede with time. It became the ground upon which her devotion was built, reshaping grief into a path that would mark the city long after her footsteps faded. As the years passed, Xenia became a familiar presence in the poorest quarters of St. Petersburg. She moved through markets, alleys, and narrow streets without destination or routine. Her life unfolded in full view of the city, yet remained resistant to explanation, preserved only through memory and repeated encounter. Early reactions were shaped by confusion and mockery. Children followed her through the streets, and adults dismissed her as unbalanced. With time, these responses softened. Repeated encounters revealed a constancy in her movements, shaped by prayer and endurance rather than impulse. Xenia spoke little about herself. When addressed, her replies were brief and often indirect, unsettling those who expected clarity or justification. She offered no explanations for her choices. Meaning emerged slowly, carried by presence and repetition rather than instruction. She accepted bread or small acts of assistance only when freely offered. She never asked, never stored provisions, and never returned favors. Merchants gradually noticed that her presence drew customers, and that kindness shown to her was followed by unexpected prosperity. Because of this, some began to look for her intentionally. Homes where she had lingered were remembered with gratitude, spoken of as places touched by peace. Xenia never remained. She departed quietly, leaving no mark beyond recollection. Even as affection grew, she resisted every attempt to define or claim her. Offers of shelter were declined, and questions about her past received no response. The city learned to recognize her pattern without containing it. Her clothing, worn thin by years of wandering, placed her outside every social structure. She belonged neither to household life nor to monastic order. Her existence unfolded entirely between these boundaries, shaped by trust and dependence. Gradually, respect replaced ridicule. The poor recognized a shared vulnerability in her presence, while others perceived strength formed through perseverance. Xenia came to be received as a quiet sign of grace within the city. Without proclamation or teaching, her life revealed another measure of holiness. Faith appeared openly among the forgotten, sustained through endurance and prayer. In this way, the streets themselves became witnesses to her devotion. As familiarity replaced suspicion, stories about Xenia began to circulate beyond her visible way of life. People recalled brief encounters that later gained meaning, and words spoken casually that resurfaced only after events had unfolded. These recollections moved slowly through the city, preserved through memory and repeated retelling. Xenia never presented herself as a guide or bearer of insight. She offered no claims about her words or actions, and gave no indication that her presence carried significance. Moments later remembered as meaningful passed without emphasis, unnoticed when they occurred. Among these memories were references to deaths she appeared to foresee. The passing of Empress Elizabeth in 1761, and later the death of the imprisoned John IV Antonovich in 1764, were linked to remarks attributed to her. These accounts remained incomplete, carried through personal testimony rather than written record. Those who encountered her learned to listen with greater care. Words that once seemed obscure were held quietly in memory, revisited only after time had passed. Meaning surfaced gradually through unfolding events and lived experience. Despite growing attention, Xenia continued her life without visible change. She gathered no followers and encouraged no interpretation of her actions. Her days remained shaped by wandering, brief exchanges, and nights spent beyond the city in prayer. The absence of self-assertion preserved the quiet character of her life. Nothing in her conduct suggested an effort to instruct or warn. Insight appeared woven into ordinary presence, inseparable from the humility that guided her path. For many, this restraint carried its own weight. The lack of emphasis protected her life from becoming display or reputation. What endured was remembered because it had never been announced. As years passed, respect deepened into trust. People approached her with openness, attentive to moments that could not be anticipated. Her presence came to be received through patience and attentiveness rather than expectation. Through these quiet exchanges, Xenia's life revealed another dimension of sanctity. Hidden sight remained bound to obscurity, sustained by prayer and endurance within the streets she never left. The final years of Xenia's life passed in the same quiet obscurity that had marked her long years of wandering. No records preserved the details of her aging, and no witnesses described a final change in her way of life. She remained among the streets and open fields of St. Petersburg, sustained by prayer until her strength slowly declined. Her death, believed to have occurred around the year 1803, passed without public notice. No announcement marked the moment, and no account recorded her final hours. Only later did memory begin to gather what had been scattered, as those who had encountered her reflected on a life lived openly and without shelter. Xenia was buried in the Smolensk cemetery of St. Petersburg. Over time, her grave became a place of quiet visitation. People arrived without ceremony, carrying grief, hope, and unspoken petitions. The site itself entered the memory of the city, associated with consolation and trust. Accounts of healing soon began to circulate among visitors. Soil taken from her grave was carried home and kept with reverence, linked to recoveries that could not be easily explained. These stories spread through personal testimony, preserved by gratitude and shared experience. As remembrance deepened, devotion followed. Xenia came to be invoked by those seeking work, stability, and companionship. The homeless remembered her as one who had shared their condition, and parents entrusted to her the search for missing children. Her intercession became connected to ordinary lives shaped by uncertainty. This veneration gradually extended beyond the cemetery. Churches and chapels were later built in her name, carrying her memory far beyond the streets she had walked. A life once dismissed as disorder entered the Church's shared remembrance through persistence over time. The title Fool for Christ came to describe her witness. It named a path shaped by voluntary poverty, exposure, and prayer lived openly among the poor. Her life resisted summary, remaining anchored in actions repeated day after day. Very little of her life was preserved in writing. Dates, personal details, and early history faded into uncertainty. What endured was presence, carried through memory and devotion shaped by lived encounter. Xenia of St. Petersburg left no teachings and no written legacy. What remained was a life offered fully to God and shared without reserve among the forgotten. Through endurance and obscurity, her memory continues to offer refuge to those who seek help without knowing where else to turn. The life of Blessed Xenia of St. Petersburg reminds us that holiness can unfold without recognition, instruction, or record. Her path was shaped by grief accepted fully, by prayer lived openly, and by a presence shared among those the city overlooked. Through years of wandering and quiet endurance, her life became a shelter for others, even when she herself possessed nothing. If stories like this help you reflect on faith carried through humility, memory, and devotion, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you support the telling of lives that continue to speak through silence, offering guidance and comfort to those who seek them today.